syllabus is the program for the series, and if you note it, you will note that this lecture is the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture, and that is a photograph of Robert, who was the inspiration for what we do here today. And I want to introduce, I don't need to introduce, but Barbara's going to come up and tell you a bit about the organization that supports this lecture series, give you a little bit of information about Robert, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So, Barbara.
It gives me great pleasure to be here in my other hat, and that is president of the community group that helps support this lecture series. It's called the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust at Sonoma State University. It was founded in 1982, and it is part of one of the most unique university community collaborations. The university pays our faculty. The Alliance works with members of our community to help defray the cost of bringing our speakers here. And it has been my great privilege to be working with this group for the last 3 years. The Alliance really looked at ways of remembering the survivors of the Holocaust, the need to tell their stories, and learn from their experiences. Those who began this collaborative effort between the community and members of the university promised to let the world know of the atrocities that had occurred during World War II. The initial intent was primarily to learn the facts, act upon them, and never forget. The name chosen by the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, and for those founding members, the acronym ASH was a significant one. As a result of these efforts and the work of Robert Harris, a successful lecture series on the Holocaust and genocide was created at the university. The partnership includes members of the community, university faculty and administrators, and students who have been part of the lecture series. And I'd like to take this second to recognize members of the Alliance who are with us. You've probably seen a few of them in our midst. Larry Carlin, Michael McCaffrey, David Song, Sylvia Suker, Christine Davidian, Dean Elaine Leader, Myrna Goodman. I think that's it. There are probably, and Scott Lipinski, who is a graduate of the series and who has just returned back. And there are about another 8 people who are not with us today. The mission is to co-sponsor the lecture series, to support SSU's Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, which Myrna is the director of, in providing programming to the larger community, including teachers in kindergarten through 12th grade, and to collaborate with other community groups working with issues related to the Holocaust and genocide. We would not be here were it not for the work of Robert Harris. Robert was a visionary, of World War II veteran, somebody who worked in a facility for troubled youngsters, and who really was the founding spirit behind the Alliance. And it is in his honor and memory that we have this entire lecture series and this particular lecture. And it's with great pleasure that I turn the mic back over to Professor Goodman. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we also need to recognize is that there were many faculty members in the beginning who were very supportive of this lecture series. And one of the inspirations, if not the moral force behind the lecture series, was Professor John Steiner, who was also a Holocaust survivor himself. And we owe a great deal to his inspiration, both his moral authority and also his intellectual rigor around issues concerning the Holocaust. Our speaker today is someone who I met this past summer at the Holocaust Museum. I had seen his book before I went to the museum and was thrilled to be able to actually get to meet him. In addition to being an excellent scholar, he is also a very, very wonderful person, which sometimes those two things don't always come together, as you know. Dr. James Waller is the Lindemann Chair and Professor of Psychology at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington. He's got his Ph.D. from the University of Kentucky in experimental social psychology. He's written several books, including the one that the students in this class read, Becoming Evil. It is, I've got lots of things that I could say about it from the press releases, but it is an eminently accessible book that students praise all the time in terms of laying out the notions of how ordinary people fall into step with people who are perpetrators. And rather than give you a summary of the book, I'm going to let Jim Waller do that. I hope you will all join me in thanking him for coming and also to welcome him to the 23rd Annual Holocaust Lecture Series.
Thanks. It is good to be here with you. Can you hear me in back if I wander out okay?
Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. Great to be here with you. It's my honor to be delivering a lecture here in the name of Roger Harris in this series. This is kind of, Becoming Evil came out about 3.5, 4 years ago. And I think since it's come out, in part, I don't know if many people read the book or if they just like the title, but there were a lot of opportunities to speak at colleges, probably 80 or some trips over the past 3 to 4 years. But this one is already unique for 3 reasons. One is, I've been here half an hour, and I have met more people in this half hour than I've met on all the other 80 trips combined. So Myrna, you've done a great job of introducing me to people. I remember no names from that. I don't remember names of people I've known for 5 years, but we're getting started. That's great. The second thing that's unique about this is I don't think I've ever been in a room, other than students of my own who I make read the book, with as many people that have read this book, or at least have it highlighted and outlined as you have. So this is a kind of unique opportunity for me. Not everyone's got through it. Scott was honest, admitted, partway through, had to give it up. That's fine. Some of you came up, things highlighted. You could have just had a highlighter in the hall, just doing things randomly for all I know, but it still feels good to see it here and highlighted. So it's good to be with you for that reason. The third one that does make this unique is that I don't think I've ever seen, and certainly not been part of, a series like this. I mean, typically when I go to speak to the college university campus, and I'd say it's true for most outside speakers, it's kind of a drop and run deal. You just go in, you do your talk. The audience who comes, both students and community members, you have no idea what they know about it, what's gone before. You have no idea once you're gone what people are going to do with it, how they're going to chew on it, how they're going to process it and unpack it with each other. But this series that maybe you take for granted because it's been going for 23 years, maybe you take for granted because Myrna keeps it going kind of seamlessly, maybe you take for granted because it's one other course in a series of courses you might take here. This is really a very unique opportunity for you to study something like the Holocaust and Genocide in just an exceptionally unusual format. And again, to just look at the quality of speakers you have here is kind of intimidating to see the people who have come before me and the people who have come after me. So thanks very much to everyone involved in the process of getting me here for this time with you. What I want to do is for about the next half hour or so, lay out for you a couple of things related to perpetrators of genocide, and then explore after that for a few minutes some questions you might have from the book or from the presentation. So I really want to do 2 major things. One is, I want to introduce you to the problem of genocide in general. In other words, why does the problem extend beyond what we can study simply in a Holocaust studies course? Why is it, you could argue to some degree, was the problem of the 20th century, and we might expect it to continue to be the problem of the 21st century as well. And then secondly, in the midst of that general problem, I will bite off one specific piece, and that's perpetrator behavior, and ask with you what seems to be a fairly simple, but I would argue is deceptively simple question, and that is, who is it that commits the extraordinary evil that we see in cases of genocide? And once we can figure out who that is, how in the world do we start to go about explaining how did they commit those cases of extraordinary evil in the context of genocide? So let's start first with the notion of social conflict in human history. You may not be able to see the PowerPoint well. It's fine. We can't do much with the lights other than turn them on or turn them off, so it'll stay like this, but you have an outline there in front of you. Don't mean to insult you with the outline or be redundant with it. You have to understand this is how I do the things I do. I have a family, 3 children. We have family meetings. They have outlines with them. It's efficient. We get things done. The second grader doesn't take us off on a sidetrack about Star Wars or whatever. So we will stay together with that. First, social conflict in human history. I'm going to start here with kind of a story from Jewish Christian tradition that some of you know well. And the story comes to us from the first book, Genesis, in Hebrew Scriptures. And the story is the story of Cain and Abel, the 2 sons of Adam and Eve. And whether you take the story to be absolutely true and foundational to theology, whether you think the story to be something more apocryphal in a way, or maybe more mythological, I think the story reveals something about human nature that we need to come to grips with. And the story, as many of you know, goes this way. That Cain and Abel, the 2 sons of Adam and Eve, are working together. They make a sacrifice to God. And for whatever reason, and Scriptures are unclear, but it probably has to do with intent, God looks favorably upon Abel's sacrifice, and he doesn't look favorably upon Cain's sacrifice. And the Scriptures go on to tell us that at some indeterminate point in the future, Cain and Abel are working in the field together, and the Scriptures say that Cain falls upon his brother Abel. He kills his brother Abel. Now what's unique about this story, and I grew up kind of the son of a preacher in Georgia, and it didn't hit me for years about the uniqueness of what this story was trying to tell us, is that this is, in the Jewish Christian tradition, the first time that death appears in the world. And understand that death could have come into the world through any number of ways. Famine, pestilence, plague, the most common way, accident. But in the Jewish Christian tradition, which is not the only religious traditions, obviously, but has shaped much of the Western understanding of human nature, in these traditions, the first time death comes into this world, it comes in the form of murder. 2 men, says Elie Wiesel, the White Red Rider on the Holocaust, 2 men, and one of them become a killer. Now, I think you could argue that this first appearance of death in our world, through the form of interpersonal conflict and murder, kind of sets our species off on a litany of interpersonal conflict, violence, murder, sometimes collective, sometimes large-scale in warfare, sometimes large-scale against innocent victims in genocide, that kind of takes us throughout much of human history. So if we fast forward several centuries, for instance, we can see a few things. Since the Napoleonic Wars, we fought an average of 6 international wars and 6 civil wars per decade. Average of 3 high-fatality struggles. These are defined as loss of life of more than 1,000 victims. An average of 3 of those struggles have been in place somewhere in the world any moment since 1900. So take any year, take any month of that year, any day of the month, any minute of that day, any second of that minute, and you got an average of 3 high-fatality struggles going on someplace in the world at that particular time. The 4 decades after the end of World War II saw 150 wars and only 26 days of world peace. Today, a third of the world's 193 nations are embroiled in conflict. That includes our country embroiled in conflict at this present time as well. Now, there's some encouraging data about this history of conflict throughout humankind's time, in that the 1990s started to see a decline in conventional warfare, but at the same time saw an increase in acts of international terrorism. So the number of people who are dying a violent death at the hands of fellow humans in the context of war, terrorism, or genocide actually still continues to increase over the course of the past several decades as well. Winston Churchill is famous for some kind of strong and outlandish quote, so a lot of times speakers will pull from him, and I'll admit that I'm one of those, but Churchill once said, "The story of the human race is war." And that's a pretty pessimistic statement, but you're hard-pressed to also say it's not true. I mean, if you look at the ways we've divided ourselves, why a group speaks this language and not this language, why a country's boundaries are here and not here, the way diseases are distributed even, that very often those distributions of culture have at their origin warfare. That war has divided up most of the social cultural world we know today has been divided up because of warfare. Plato's another famous thinker who once said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." And I like that. That's a powerful quote. Because what it's saying, no one sitting here today is ever going to see the end of warfare as a way of human negotiation or a way of human relations or misrelations. The only people that will see the end of war will be the dead. And unfortunately, warfare has left us, many of those dead. You see over the course of the past several centuries the escalating toll in terms of number of casualties that warfare has taken over the course of time. The 20th century saw 5 times the number of casualties as the 19th century and 10 times the number of casualties as the 18th century. And again, you'll have some think tanks today who argue to you that warfare in the 21st century is starting to decline and has been declining since about 1992 at the end of the Cold War. And that's true, but in terms of international deaths, again, related to terrorism, those have actually started to swing up and have replaced much of the people that we saved because we're engaging in less warfare. Their lives are now still being lost because of the increase in international terrorism. Now, I don't really do work in psychology of war or warfare. What I do work in is the psychology of genocide and genocide studies. So I'm interested in those situations where acceptable war, and some of you may say there's no such thing as acceptable war, and that would be great for another lecture series that you could put on here. But let's just say that acceptable warfare, there's a line between acceptable military conduct with legitimate military combatant versus another legitimate military combatant, and the other side of that line, where military activities or paramilitary activities are directed against civilians, non-legitimate combatants, non-combatants in warfare. And when that line is crossed, we've left this point of war-related study and we've entered this field of genocide studies. Rolf Hilberg is credited with this distinction when he talks about genocide. He says a lot of cultures have arisen where a culture has said about a group of people living in its midst, we no longer wish this people to live among us. And what have they done with those people? They've pushed them out. They've made them go to other countries. If they couldn't push them out, they've ghettoized them, and we've done this here in America. There have been groups of people of color in this country that we've said we no longer wish them to live among us, so let's place them here in their place, or here in their place, but it keeps them separate from a good number of us. But Hilberg says what happens in genocide is the final part of that phrase is lopped off. In other words, the phrase now changes from there's a group of people we no longer wish to live among us to there's a group of people we no longer wish to live, period. And when that happens, when a political, social, religious group comes to power and it says there's a group of people living in our community that we no longer wish to live, period, now we've entered the realm of genocide and genocide studies. And it would be painful enough if what you had to study in genocide was the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews who died at the hands of Nazi Germany between 1939 to 1945, a loss of life from which the Jewish community has yet to reconstitute itself numerically in terms of demographics, and may not for decades, maybe even a century or so, demographers would say. But unfortunately, if you look at the 20th century, the Holocaust becomes one piece of a larger puzzle of destruction that allows many scholars to look back at the 20th century and label it the age of genocide. Beginning in 1904 with the destruction of the native Southwest African population, the Guerrero population, numbered about 80,000. German colonizers were in Southwest Africa. Southwest African natives decided to revolt, fight back against the colonial powers of Germany, and the response from part of Germany was to wipe them out almost in their entirety. Almost every single one of 8,000. Continues between 1915 and 1923 with the destruction of 1.5 million Christian Armenians by the Turkish Empire. You will have a lecture on the Armenian Genocide coming up in this series. You'll know that April 24th of every year, Armenians gather around the world to commemorate this genocide, which is absolutely necessary because the Turkish government still denies it ever happened. So when we talk about issues of denial and reaction to genocide, these aren't theoretical academic exercises. There are people living in the world and in this country who will deny, as you know, the existence of the Holocaust. But the Armenian genocide, as a victim of denial today, still continues at the highest levels of government in Turkey, and we still push in our country for our country to push Turkey and say, you can't continue in this denial of something with this much historical accuracy and background and testimony to it. Something has to be done to understand it. Something has to be done to begin to reconcile the suffering of people that were affected here. Implementation of Soviet man-made famine in the Ukraine in 32 and 33, the Holocaust, mass killings and genocide in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Guatemala, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina. 20th century is the age of genocide. Even though as we look forward to the 21st century, we see genocide alerts still ongoing in Sudan and Chechnya and Ethiopia. So at Whitworth, when I teach my courses in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and I have research assistants working with me on books like Becoming Evil, and they ask questions, is there any future in the field of genocide studies if you want to be a student or a faculty member in it? I'd love to say, absolutely not. It's a done deal, it's just history now, but the truth is, there's a lot of future in this field, because in the 20th century, we seem to have perfected, in a morally inverted sense of the word, we perfected mass destruction on each other. Now let's add up all the victims here that you see on this slide, and I want to give you a comparison because I think it will say a little bit about the things that draw our attention today. In the 20th century, anti-state terrorism, by that we mean the events of 9/11, things that happen when a group in power tries to inflict terror on a population, took about 500,000 lives in the 20th century, 500,000 people. Every one of those 500,000 people loved someone, they were loved by someone, they had hopes, they had dreams, they had aspirations. Tragedy in every single one of those 500,000 cases. But let's contrast that to state-sponsored terrorism, genocide. In the 20th century, state-sponsored terrorism took the lives of 60 million victims, men, women, and children. 120 times the death toll of anti-state terrorism was lost to state-sponsored terrorism and genocide in the 20th century. So very often people who work in the field, we ask ourselves a question, why in the world are we so focused on anti-state terrorism and we act as if state-sponsored terrorism is not a big deal? Because if you want to quantify human suffering in terms of loss of life, and you'd say to someone, which problem would you want to solve? I mean, I would think the problem would be the one that's causing 60 million deaths in the past century and doesn't appear to be abating in any significant sense of the word in this coming century. So, the players in the tragedy of genocide are threefold, and I just want to put this in the context of what we'll be studying. Obviously, will be the victims of genocide. Again, in this series, we've had some outstanding opportunities to hear firsthand from victims of genocide. When you hear from a Holocaust survivor today, prize that opportunity, because 10 years from now, you're likely not going to have that opportunity. Many of you who choose to have children, your children will never have that opportunity to hear them in person. When you hear from survivors of other genocides, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, it wasn't until a few years ago you could still hear from survivors of the Armenian genocide and their descendants. I mean, those are opportunities to be cherished because, again, those victim stories are a compelling piece of understanding the tragedy of genocide. Another piece of it is understanding the perspective of bystanders. And again, some of what you've done here, I'm sure some of what Myrna does in her sociology program, helps you understand maybe what's the key question about genocide studies, which is, well, we know there'll be victims, and we know there'll be some perpetrators, but most of the world's going to be bystanders. And many people have been credited with this quote. Probably the one most often credited is Albert Einstein, who says, all that has to happen for evil to flourish is for good men to sit by and allow it to happen. So maybe this is our key question in genocide studies, is who are the bystanders, and why don't they do anything? Why don't they step up and try to make a difference in a hurting world? But my focus has been, rather than on victims or bystanders, has been to look at the issue of perpetrators. And when I say I work in perpetrator studies, I think you can hear three things there. And let me tell you the one thing I want you to hear and the two things we're not talking about. One is, I don't work with architects of genocide. All right? This is the most common conception. If my mother were here tonight from South Carolina and you asked her what I did, I'm sure she'd say, he studies Hitler. Because that's her conception of what perpetrators are. And I don't want to belittle or minimize the importance of architects. But I do want us to understand that most architects, the masterminds of genocide, themselves never actually kill anyone face to face. Now they're still fully, legally and morally responsible for what they set in motion. But as the architects, they very relatively rarely actually bloody their hands with killing. I'd say the same thing is true for mid-level bureaucrats. In the Holocaust, this would be someone like Adolf Eichmann, who kept the trains running so that Jews could reach their appointed place of death at the correct time in an efficient manner. Architects, bureaucrats are essential to genocide. These are the people we chase when genocide is over. They're the ones we want to bring to justice. But I would argue that there's a third level of perpetrator that we haven't studied a lot that we need to, and that's the rank and file killer. The men, and occasionally women, at the front lines of what you see here in this Einsatzgruppen photo, who are actually pulling the triggers. The men and women in Rwanda who are actually swinging the machete, who are actually beating people to death with a masu, clubs studded with nails. The Turkish men, and occasionally women, who are actually beating Armenians to death with spades, with shovels, with hoes. Those people on the front line, the rank and file killers. Because without this group, genocide isn't going to happen. I mean, if all we have are architects and bureaucrats, you know, they may have some terrible ideas in mind about how they're going to inflict tragedy on the population, but when push comes to shove, they have to find people that actually carry out the policy. They have to find the people to kill. And so I would argue that the rank and file are important for us to understand, because without these people, genocide isn't going to happen. But they're the group we know the least about, because by and large, they escape prosecution. I mean, think of the tribunals today that you would know about for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, the Nuremberg trials. Who are we bringing to trial on those? It's Slobodan Milosevic, okay, the architect of genocide. It is all the leading architects and some of the very notorious bureaucrats. But the rank and file people who actually kill are almost too numerous for us to bring to trial. And one of the phrases I use in the book is the phrase, genocide overwhelms justice. And what I mean by that is most genocidal societies can't afford to bring every single rank and file perpetrator to justice, and their reasoning, and I understand it, their reasoning is, well, if we get the architects, then genocide won't happen again. And we'll just keep our eyes open for all the other architects that we could watch out early for to make sure that we don't let them get in power. But again, I would argue maybe the better understanding would be rank and file. Where do all the killers come from? If we can cut that off, then maybe we've made some progress. Maybe the 21st century doesn't look as genocidal as the 20th century. So my general principle, and this is a horrible PowerPoint slide, by the way. You're never supposed to put this many words on a slide, but there's a shorthand version for what's on the slide, and it's this, that humans are the weapons of genocide. And what I mean by that is that sometimes, I think especially people who study the Holocaust, they get caught up in the technological savvy of the Holocaust. All the bureaucracy, all the incredible technological, for its time, almost wizardry that the Nazis used to destroy 6 million Jews. But you have to step outside of that and say, most of the genocides in the 20th century were not at all technologically sophisticated. They're using farm tools to kill 1.5 million people. Rwanda's 800,000 victims in 100 days. Now, there's no 100-day period of the Holocaust you can take, and you can find 800,000 victims in 100 days. I mean, Rwanda was a frenzy of killing. Very, very little ammunition, a ton of machete, a ton of masu, a ton of people with hands and feet who could kick and beat and pummel other people to death. So genocide is not going to be an increasing problem because technology is getting more sophisticated. I will argue that genocide is essentially a human issue. It remains a problem because the weapons of genocide are humans, and we shouldn't get caught up in all the technology pieces. We need to see it as a human problem. And the other thing that surprises me about studying genocide at this level is that you look at regimes that have wanted to commit genocide. Political, social, religious group comes to power, they want to commit genocide. They have been stopped at times. They've been stopped at times because of resistance from the victim group. The victims have stood up and said, we're not going to go to our deaths easily. And they've actually stopped some genocides. They've been stopped by resistance from other people in the community who stand up and say, hey, we may not like or understand this group of people, but that doesn't mean you can kill them. They may be stopped by international pressure. Although between you and I, not to leave this room, if you want to commit genocide, you'll have done pretty much what you wanted to do before the international community decides to do anything about it. Okay? But theoretically, all those things could be obstacles. But here's what's amazing. Here's the one thing a regime never has had to worry about: finding killers. No regime has ever had to throw its hands up and say, I'd love to commit genocide, but we just can't find the people to do it. They can always find the people to do it, in large numbers and over an extended period of time. Now, this isn't a picture of a great world. I mean, I'd love to live in a world where a group of evil people come to power and they want to commit mass murder, but they do have to throw up their hands and say, we just can't find the people to do it. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where when evil comes to power, it can recruit enough men and women to do exactly what it wants to do in the manner it wants to do it. Now, some of you are sitting there and you're saying, well, this is true because genocide's always done by the military, and military personnel have to do what they're told. That's part of the lifestyle that they choose. But a lot of genocide in the 20th century does not have a heavy military involvement. The Rwandan genocide, very little military involvement in the rank and file. In the Holocaust, there are episodes of extermination of Jews that have very little minimal involvement, but have groups of neighbors turning on other groups of neighbors, like Goodman in Poland, for instance. Certainly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, relatively little military influence in some portions or pockets of that genocide. So we can't just sidestep it and say, well, it's a military issue. Because again, it's not. It remains, in my mind, a human issue. So the two questions it drives me to are these. One, how many people does it take to carry out genocide and mass killing? This is a question we don't often think about. You know, I'll have, I don't know, 50, 60 students come in a semester in my Holocaust course at Whitworth, and if we did a cultural knowledge test the first day of class, we sometimes do, ask them how many people died in the Holocaust, specifically Jewish victims. Most of them, as a matter of cultural literacy, will know between 5.5 to 6 million. I mean, most Americans who are culturally literate in some way will probably be able to come up with that figure. But if you ask the corresponding question, how many people does it take to kill 6 million people? We don't think of that question a lot, because 6 million is an abstraction. You've never seen 6 million of anything in your life. And the Holocaust Museum has to work hard to figure out how do you communicate 6 million. So when Myrna and I were there this past summer, the final exhibit as you leave the museum, I think now is eyeglasses. And it's just this huge pile of eyeglasses from Auschwitz. It's been shoes in the past. It's been a mound of hair in the past. And it represents a couple thousand people, nowhere near 6 million. But the museum knows you don't know what 6 million looks like, so they just want you to leave having an idea that this is a lot of people impacted by this. So the number itself can become an abstraction. But how many people does it take to kill 6 million people? I mean, obviously, we're never going to have precise figures on this, but the estimates in the Holocaust run as high as 500,000. That may be 500,000. And again, we're not including here Hitler, Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, Eichmann. We're talking about the frontline people who, after the war was over, after they shot, after they beat, after they killed, they went back to wherever they came from in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and they did whatever they were doing before the war. By and large, almost all of them escaped prosecution and persecution of any type. So we're not talking here about a small number of people. If we look at Rwanda, I said 800,000 people in a 100-day period. I have a colleague in Rwanda who, when he first told me this, I thought it was ludicrous. When I asked him how many perpetrators literally killed in Rwanda, he said he thought 1 million. And it took me by surprise because I said, there are only 800,000 victims. How do you have more perpetrators than you have victims? And he said, well, in Rwanda, a lot of the killing was done by groups. So a group of 10 to 12 youth would gang up on 1 or 2 people and kick, beat, club, or hack them to death. So that's what he was basing that estimate on. I still think it's too high, but I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that maybe 300,000 people are living in Rwanda today still, by and large, who killed in the genocide, who killed in some gruesome ways, in some hostile ways, who took 800,000 lives in a 100-day period. And they're still there, and they're pretty much, most of them, still doing what they did before the genocide started. A few thousand still awaiting trial in prison, but most of them back to where they were before the genocide started. So my point is here that even though we can't get an exact number, you have to understand that genocide doesn't happen just out of the air. Genocide happens because humans perpetrate it. And genocide happens because a large number of humans kill other humans over an extended period of time. Second question is, who in the world are these people? I mean, where do they come from? I mean, if all genocide was the Holocaust, you could get away from this question by saying, well, these were just German people. They're just kind of weird, you know, off the fringe Germans. Germans are a little odd anyway, and they just got caught up with something and went that direction, and it was horrible, but it was just a German thing. I mean, you know, that sounds ridiculous, but 10 years ago, a researcher at Harvard by the name of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen wrote a book that essentially said that and sold about 800 times more copies than my book will ever think about selling. So people buy into that simplistic notion. But you got to go back a few slides and you say, well, it can't be a German deal because it also happened in Turkey. Maybe it's a German and a Turkish deal. Well, it can't be that because it also happened in Rwanda and it also happened in Bosnia. And pretty soon, you can't find a place in the world where it hasn't happened, including this country and the Native American experience during westward expansion in the late 1800s. So this is not a geographical problem. It's not a problem unique to one culture. This is a problem, I would argue, that's universal to human culture and society. And this is the question that drives what I do and how I do it, is where do these people come from? And what type of people are they, and how are they recruited to do what they do here? Now, I'm not the first person to ask this question, who are these people and where they come from, obviously. Other people have asked it, and they've come up with some answers a little bit different from mine, and I'll sketch out a couple of these just pretty quickly. But some people have argued for the notion, and again, this makes sense. You see something extraordinary, and you think it must have some corresponding extraordinary cause. So if we see something like genocide, we think, well, it has to be some extraordinary origin for that extraordinary evil. And people have argued this, and some people have argued for what's called the extraordinary nature of the collective. And this argument very simply is groups of people come together and bad things happen, because groups always bring out the worst in people. And again, I have 3 children, and those children have sleepovers, and I have some sympathy for the idea that groups can bring out the worst. I mean, I've seen kind of that bad side, and you've seen it at your parties and events on campus. I mean, you know it can happen. But you also know that groups lie at the heart of some of the greatest things about the human experience. Groups brought democracy to Czechoslovakia. Groups lie at the heart of your faculty and your institution here, and your staff and administration that do great things here. Groups lie at the heart of cooperative, nonviolent institutions like hospitals and social programs. I mean, groups do great things. So I don't think we can say, well, it's just groups because all groups are all bad all the time. Secondly, I don't think we can just say it's ideology, as Goldheim tried to say, that what it is just a belief system. And it's the belief system that makes people do what they do. Because again, one of the things I think we know in social psychology is that often it's what people do that makes their belief system. It's not the belief system that drives what they do. And if you read perpetrator testimony as I have, you'll see that for some perpetrators, ideology is a big deal. And they speak of it often and at length until you're about ready to fall asleep having read so much of it. But for other perpetrators, they have no idea what ideology means. And if you could explain to them this is what ideology means, they don't know if they have one. I mean, Rwanda is not an ideological genocide. Maybe you could argue that the Holocaust ideology plays a big role. Certainly not the only role. But in Rwanda, ideology just isn't part of what is happening. You interview perpetrators in Rwanda, and you ask them why they killed their neighbors. There's no ideological basis. It is, they had a cow. And the radio said I could kill them. And if I killed them, I got the cow. And that's why I killed them. That's the only reason. There's no ideology. It's opportunity. Bosnia and Herzegovina, same type of deal. It masquerades as this centuries-old ideology between warring peoples, but it's a land grab. It's Milosevic wanting more land, the greatest Serbian nationhood. So we have to be careful also about ideology. And then finally, some people have said, well, it must be extraordinary individuals. And this is the most common answer I think people give. Who commits genocide? Well, it's people who are already sick. They're pathological, or they have some type of twisted, deviant personality. And if you read the book, you know that I take 2 full chapters to kind of lay out the weaknesses of this particular position. But the very short story of it is that you could argue perpetrators of genocide evidence less pathology than the general population. General population pathology runs about 10% rate. But in perpetrators, pathologically disturbed people make good genocidal killers. They're irresponsible, they're immature, they're not trustworthy. And you could actually argue that those type of people are selected out so that the number of pathological people who commit genocide may actually be lower than what you see in the general population, not higher. And every battery of psychological tests we've given to try and find pathology in perpetrators from Nuremberg on, we've just not found it. I mean, we find it occasionally, but not what you'd expect. But of course, we want it to work that way. Because then, if it's truly pathological people, you and I don't have to worry. We can go to bed at night in beautiful Sonoma Valley, and it's no big deal. We don't know anybody who's going to commit genocide like this. Same story for personality. You'd love to find a personality structure that you could say, well, if someone's like this and like this and like this, that makes them likely to commit genocide. Again, we've had decades of looking for this personality profile, and we haven't found it. And I don't think we're going to find it. What you find when you look at perpetrators is you find they come from every walk of life. They are rich, they are poor, they're religious, they're not religious, they're only children, they're from families with 10 children. They are well-educated, they are opera singers, they are poorly educated, they've dug ditches for much of their life. I mean, any trait, demographically or personality-wise, you want to give, you can pretty well find perpetrators kind of all the way along that continuum. So my response to this has been to say, and it's a central argument, as many of you know in the book, that it's ordinary people, like you and me, who commit this extraordinary evil. And again, this is, I don't enjoy traveling the country and making this argument, and writing the book, and writing an article. I'd much rather make the argument that it's very unusual people that you and I will never know that do this type of evil. It would have been great a couple days ago when I left Spokane if I could have tucked my kids in for the last time before leaving, and really in my heart thought, the type of stuff I study is horrible and terrible, and none of you will ever know anyone who does anything like this. And none of you will ever be anyone who could do anything like this. I would love to live in that world. But I also have to take a step back and say, that doesn't fit with all I've studied about perpetrator behavior. Because all I've studied tells me that I do work, and I live, and I fellowship with people who could well be capable, given certain circumstances, of engaging in these types of behaviors. And as much as I study it, I would love to be able to tell you that I'd be absolutely immune to it, and I'd be the one person you could bank on that wouldn't do this, should the circumstances come up. But studying this field has been one of the most humbling experiences of my life, and I hold no illusions at all about what I might be likely to do or not to do, given some of the situations that we find in some genocidal societies. So I like Huxley's quote here. He's Darwin's bulldog, and Huxley says in 1860, "My business is to teach my aspirations or hopes to conform themselves to fact, not to make my facts harmonize with my aspirations." And really what he's saying here is that as educated people, which you all are in the process of becoming, you hold truth, you hold an esteem for truth. You hold truth in high regard. And a lot of times that truth that you hold an esteem for will be great. It'll be flattering, it'll make you feel good about yourself and this place in the world, and you'll be glad you grabbed that truth. But because you hold an esteem for truth, it also means that sometimes you'll have to grasp a truth that is not good, that is not flattering, that does not make you think that highly of yourself and your place in the world, and makes it harder for you to go to sleep at night than you'd like to, perhaps. And I would think, or I would argue, that this is one of those truths. That it's ordinary people like you and I who commit the vast majority of the extraordinary evil we see in genocide, mass killing. And I want to turn that truth around and say, if that is true, rather than be depressing and discouraging, now maybe it's something we can wrestle with and we can find an antidote for. Because if it's not just weird people out there, but it's people close to home, like us, then maybe we can understand how is it that we can stop people from perpetrating this type of extraordinary evil. So the bulk of what I've done then is to try to lay out a model, and this is on the back side of the outline, and right now you're probably getting a headache going, oh my God, I'm going to go over this or not. I'm just going to put this up here and make a couple of quick comments about it. Once you've made the argument that it's ordinary people who do this extraordinary evil, you've got to figure out some explanation for it, right? I wish you didn't have to. My job would be a lot easier, but now what I do is try to figure out what are the steps people go through that take an ordinary person and allow them to commit this evil. I'm going to finish here with an example that, I don't want you to worry about the steps of this model. I want you to think more about the example because I think it fits it well. One of the first perpetrators I ever studied in depth, his testimony, was a death camp guard from Auschwitz who had the unique task of when women and children came together to Auschwitz, he had to separate the two. Because as many of you know who studied the Holocaust, Auschwitz was not a chaotic place. It was a place where the Nazis prided themselves on efficiency. Music was playing over loudspeakers. Guards actually had a politeness and a kindness to them because they didn't want to have to deal with a rowdy crowd or an anxious crowd. It was easier for them to kill and do what they had to do if they kept the situation calm. And this particular guard decided the easiest way for him to separate women and children was just to say to the mother, who's been on a cattle car here for days, perhaps weeks, and this is the first act of kindness she gets, and he says to her, just let me hold your child, you'll go this way, you'll get clean, you'll get clothing, we do the same thing to the children over here, and at the end of it, you're reunited. Now we know in the hindsight of history, this is not a good decision to make, to give one's child over to a guard at Auschwitz. But again, the people arriving there, Auschwitz doesn't bear in their mind what it bears in our mind today. So on no fewer than 24 occasions, this guard then, at trial after the war, is seen by eyewitnesses to take the children and walk to the nearest cinder block wall a few yards away and take them by the heels and just swing them into the wall until their brains were beaten out. It's a horrible story, and again, our comfort thing, what we want to reach for is we want to say, that guy was evil from the beginning. This is the guy who lit cats on fire, who from birth on you knew that was bad news. Okay? And that's comforting because that makes our world predictable and safe, and we know the bad people, we identify them, and it's all good. But the story of this man is completely different. 6 years before he's doing this unspeakable thing in Auschwitz, he's a school teacher in a small town in southern Bavaria, Germany. He's a member of his local Catholic church. He has won several times the community award for Father of the Year. He's a wonderful husband. He's a doting father. He's a very dutiful and faithful son to his mother, who still lives in the area. By all accounts, he is the warmest, kindest, gentlest of men. And when the Nazis come to power in 1933, he's supposed to start class with a Heil Hitler, and he refuses to do it. He's not a Nazi. A student in his class threatens to inform on him and tell what he's doing. So to keep his job, he begins to start class with a half-hearted Heil Hitler, and then 6 years down the road, he's doing what he's doing in Auschwitz. Now you can kind of do two things here. You can shut your mind off and say, well, he's just a monster. And that's who he was from the beginning. I don't care what you think he was like as a school teacher. He was a monster, and that's what he was all the way. Or you can put yourself in a more complex position of saying, how do I understand that 6-year window? What happens to someone to take them from this to this? And until we understand what happens in that period of transformation, we don't have any hope of trying to stop it, right? If you want to stop a disease, bird flu, virus, you've got to understand the constituent causes of it to try and break it down to stop it. That's all in a nutshell that I've tried to do with this book and my work, is to say, if we can understand the forces that kind of drive people to do this type of evil, maybe we can start to put some antidotes in how we relate to each other, how we educate each other, that makes it less likely for people to perpetrate this type of killing rather than more likely. And then the final thing I'll say about this slide is, if you're still semi-conscious at this point and you've read the book, you know that this model looks different from what you have in your book. This model comes from the second edition of Becoming Evil, which is out about 2 months from now from Oxford. And the second edition, one of the big changes we made, in addition to updating all the many chapters on genocide and so on, is I did tweak the model a bit on the basis of feedback from people like Myrna and other scholars around the world who have looked at the first edition and said, this is helpful, this is less helpful. And so this model reflects some of those updates that you wouldn't see there in the first edition. And then finally, I think a couple things to keep in mind is, again, we're not dealing with a problem that is over. The age of genocide, unfortunately, I think we can expect at this point that the 21st century may be more horrendous than the 20th century. Why? In part because of two things that are related. Continuing exponential population growth, and with that, a corresponding scarcity of resources. So for instance, you look at Africa today. Africa is the most conflict-ridden continent in the world. About 7 out of 10 of the conflicts in Africa are over water rights and water availability. It's a scarcity of that resource. If we can't bring to bear the greatest minds in the world to understand how you take limited resources and make them more available for a greater number of people, we're going to have greater and greater numbers of conflicts escalate, and some of those conflicts will flame up and become genocidal. Certainly it's what's happening in Sudan today. Part of it's what's happening in Ethiopia. Scarcity of resources in terms of economic resources, I think, lies in part of what's happening in Chechnya today as well. So again, unfortunately, we're not talking about something here that is only a history. We're talking now about still thousands of people dying monthly in Sudan, Africa's largest country, while the world pretty much sits by and watches. Now, 2 years ago, when I was doing lectures like this, most people wouldn't have heard of Sudan. We've made progress. You've heard of Sudan. You know what's going on there. Jerry Fowler is going to come and speak to you from the U.S. Holocaust Museum later this semester about it. Probably the key person in the nation, outside of Nicholas Kristof, to speak to you about what's happening in Sudan. But the question is, once we know, what do we do about a situation like that? What does the world do? And what do you do as individuals? Secondly, I do think it's important to realize that what I've tried to do is help us explain or understand the behavior. But I've never been about trying to excuse that behavior. Sometimes people, I think, confuse explanation and understanding with excusing and apologetics. Just because we can understand an evil behavior doesn't make that behavior any less morally reprehensible, or doesn't make the behavior any less morally or legally accountable. Explaining and understanding and moral accusation and responsibility, it seems to me, are two different spheres in this particular endeavor. So I would say don't be shy away, and I certainly have to keep this in mind. Don't be afraid of trying to understand how ordinary people do extraordinary evil, because some part of that is going to explain it away. It doesn't. Even if we ever come up with a perfect model that helps us understand that guard in Auschwitz, he probably had 500 decision points in that 6-year period where he could have done something different. And he still didn't have to do what he did when he took the child by the heels and walked to the nearest cinder-block wall. So at every moment in our life, we have those type of moral moments and decisions that even if I start to unpack the layers or unwrap the layers and try to understand why he did what he did, it doesn't make what he did any less, it doesn't make it pardonable, it's not exculpatory, he still retains full moral and legal accountability for what he did with that. So I think we have to be careful in any discussion of making sure that we don't confuse those two options. And again, finally, many of you read the book, second edition due out in a couple months. So I would love to take a few minutes here to hear any questions or comments you have before we break. Yes?
I'd like to ask about your methodology. You talk about ordinary people, and Christopher Browning, of course, spoke about ordinary men. Did you read the same testimony? And also, were you able to do any oral histories, and have you interviewed perpetrators?
Great question. Methodology on this, I'm a social psychologist by training, which means when I usually study what I study, you study it with the people doing it, okay? Where I started this project 10 years ago, my wife and I were living in Germany for the summer. I interviewed 3 perpetrators who had served time, committed crimes in the Holocaust, served time, and I was able to set up face-to-face oral interviews with them. They had all given their testimony. I'd read their testimonies in other cases, but I thought in my training, this is how I do what I do, is face-to-face and do as much as I can. And I'll do the same thing in Rwanda coming up next year. The problem is that perpetrators have clouded the recollections of what they did and why they did it because they're so caught up in the apologetic piece of it that their self-presentation is all that you're getting. If you're interested in self-presentation strategies, it's a great idea to interview perpetrators face-to-face. But I'm interested more in what are the things that you did and didn't do that you're either not able to tell me or not willing to tell me, and I couldn't get that from face-to-face. So I left Germany flustered and frustrated because I thought, this is going to be a weird one, because I can't study this one by talking to the people themselves. I'm going to have to study it by talking to everyone else who was around them in some way. So what I've likened it to is as a perpetrator standing in the middle of a room. And actually, it's easier for me to get information by being outside the room and looking through all the windows into that room for people who were there at that same time, for things that perpetrator said in testimony closer to that event, for bystander victim accounts. I actually get a better picture of what I'm trying to get at rather than talking to that person face to face. Now, I still want to, Rwanda is my next research project, and I do have plans to interview with specific questionnaires perpetrators in Rwanda to see if I can still get something there from those face-to-face that I can't get from other accounts. But this was methodologically was a different beast for me because I had to do it from the outside looking in, and that's not usually how social scientists do their work. So, different strategy. Good question.
How many perpetrators were in the military?
In the Holocaust?
Or any military? In other words, I was in the military, and my job was to kill people.
Right.
And when I take that oath, that's what I'm involved with. Now, am I called a perpetrator?
Right, right. No, in the cases of genocide, the perpetrators I study are people who target and kill non-military combatants, so civilians. Some of those are military personnel in the Holocaust. Other cases, 20th genocide, Rwanda, Bosnia, the Armenian genocide, relatively few of those would be military personnel. Many of them are part of groups that are called paramilitaries. They'll have their own uniforms, they'll have their own language, but they're not their own vocabulary, but they're not a recognizable state legitimated military force of any time. Yes?
When you did your interviewing and your expertise as you have, what would you say the perpetrators, what are they like after they committed their crimes? Like, how do they feel? And what do their lives look like? Do they have remorse or do they ignore it?
Right.
You know, like from a psychological perspective as far as I mean.
That's a good question. Yeah, the question was, what are perpetrators like after they've committed the evil? Are they remorseful? How do they cope with it, respond to it, and so on? I think this kind of runs the gamut here. I mean, someone like Robert J. Lifton, who's a psychoanalyst who's worked with doctors at Auschwitz, would say, after it's over, they just turn off their Auschwitz self, and they just go back to whoever they were in the beginning. And they don't really have hallucinations, they don't have nightmares, they don't worry about it a lot. But by and large, they kind of put that behind them. I don't know if that's typical of most perpetrator behavior, because even though perpetrators get relatively used to killing fairly quickly, I do think it leaves a legacy there. I do think it leaves a taint there. And we have, for instance, some research from Germany suggesting that perpetrators in the Holocaust then had higher than normal rates of abusive behavior as husbands and as parents after the war. I do think there's a recidivism rate for many perpetrators that makes them likely to engage in violent behavior again. But, you know, the thing I'm struck by is more the mental gymnastics perpetrators use to live with themselves once it's said and done. And again, you and I have to deal with this. I mean, we do bad things. Nothing like what we're talking about here. But you and I have done bad things, and we know that mentally we'll work our way around why it was okay to cheat on that paper or that exam or park in that handicapped spot even though you're not, you don't have a permit for that. We figure out mental gymnastics to make that okay. Perpetrators do the same thing on a much larger scale. They will do what they need to cognitively to help themselves live with what they did. And if you read perpetrator testimony closely, or you interview them closely, you'll see this sneak out. So you'll read perpetrator testimony after the war, and I'm sorry for what I did to Jews. It wasn't right to do. I was just following orders. But Jews really are part of their own victimization, and they do deserve this in some way, and we're trying to take over the world. And it's at that point where you realize, all the cultural mindset pieces that helped you see the victim group in that way, you don't just erase those when it's over and you can't kill anymore. They're still there. They're still part of how you think about this group of people. And it's why the issue for me in genocide studies now is, how do you put perpetrators and victims back together? Because, see, we didn't have to do that much after the Holocaust. Jews fled to the United States and Canada, and predominantly Israel, but very seldom did they have to live shoulder to shoulder with perpetrators. That's not happening in Rwanda and Bosnia. These are not people fleeing those countries. They're going back to their home in Rwanda, and they're living next door to someone who tried to kill them and their family. So now the question of how does a perpetrator deal with what they did, that's not just a perpetrator question, that's a communal, societal question that if we can't answer that for perpetrators and victims, how in the world are they supposed to live together after that's over? So it's a great question.
So you call it the age genocide, and I'm thinking, well, what does that mean exactly? The other thing that happened a lot during the age genocide is sort of the rise of the nation state. And I was wondering how much of a role do you think that the nation state, the highly organized, centralized government plays in perpetrators in the genocides, in the age of genocide?
Yeah, your question is really a broader one about the relationship between modernity and genocide, because part of the rise of modernity is the rise of the nation state. Are the two related in some way? Absolutely. But I want to be careful about making that direct relationship and say it's something about the nation state and rise of modernity that led to this, because again, we see too many things that are more tribal in the case of Rwanda and Bosnia and Sudan. I mean, these are not strong nation state areas, but yet still mass violence is happening. So for me, the issue of genocide, and even here I'm a little uncomfortable with it being called state-sponsored terrorism, because it can be terrorism that's not necessarily sponsored by the state. It can be a social group in power, a religious group in power. So I don't want to limit it to nation state or modernity influences, but I do think they've played a part in it, but I don't want to limit it to that. After the Holocaust, that's really all we talked, when we talked about genocide, it was in the modernity nation state mindset of this is, nation states have been great, modernity's been great, but now we see the dark side of that. But since the Holocaust, we've got to understand that nation state modernity has had a little bit less to do with most of the genocides since 1945 than many people would have thought. So, long way of saying, great question. I do think it's related, but I certainly would never want to reduce it to that solely. Part of that, understand, is my field. I'm a social psychologist. I will look at it completely differently than a historian or than a political scientist who may respond differently to your question.
I know that you are more focused on perpetrators and especially the rape and violent killers. I was wondering if you had an opinion what would be on bystanders and their responsibility or lack of responsibility in these situations.
Yeah, it's a good question about bystander behavior. A lot of times I try to evade this by just saying, I'm just the evil guy. I mean, all I'm studying is evil. And the good stuff and the bystander stuff, other people are studying, they do a great job with. But the connection for me is, when perpetrators do evil, to me, they're able to do it in some ways because they constrict their universe of moral commitment. In other words, all of us have a group of people close to us to whom we would say, I'm morally committed to them. If my wife is in trouble, I'm helping in a second. My children at home call, they need something, I'm getting there as soon as I can. My mother-in-law is further out in the circle, but I'll help her. When I have the moment there, I'll get to it. But the question is, how tight are these circles of commitment, or what Helen Fine has called a universal moral obligation? Perpetrators make their circles so small that whoever falls outside it, it's not only right to kill them, but it's wrong not to kill them. And notice the difference in that phraseology. Not only right to kill them, but it becomes wrong if you don't kill them, because they're so far outside of universal moral obligation. I see that same phenomenon in bystander behavior. Not the killing piece, but the helping piece. That if it's someone in my moral community, they live close to me, same religion, same values, part of my family in some way, I will help. I won't be a bystander. But if it's someone who falls outside of that community, I'm very unlikely to help. I'm not going to kill them necessarily, because most people aren't perpetrators. What most of us are, by definition, will be bystanders. So we're not going to say we're going to kill people, but again, do they mean enough to us for us to help? Okay? And this is what the Clinton administration said after Rwanda. As one administration official said off the record, after all, who gives a damn, it's Africa. That's a statement about moral community. And we're making the same, I mean, we have to make those judgments. If what is happening in Sudan is happening in Napa Valley, we're doing a lot more, right? Because physically it's more proximate, we know people there, they're like us. Sudan seems a world apart, because it is a world apart, and we have to recognize that. But we see bystander communities like Les Chambon in Nazi-occupied France who say, for whatever reason, okay, it's not just my community, but it's a much larger community, and as that community expands, I become more likely to be involved in good rather than be a bystander. Isn't this part of education? Is this socialization. You're an educated person. You know more about the world. You feel more responsible for the world. The world becomes more a part of your moral community. And to me, that's the issue with bystanders that's similar to perpetrators is how do we get people into that community instead of being excluded from it?
How often are women
How often are women
perpetrators?
perpetrators? Great question. First edition, I didn't know the answer to this question about female perpetrators, so if you read the first edition, I did what a lot of authors do who are too afraid to admit they don't know it. I buried it in this very long footnote that you'll never read, and basically a 2-page footnote says, I don't know what to say about female perpetrators. But since that, I now in the second edition, I actually have a good portion of the chapter devoted to female perpetrators because we are getting a lot more information about them. If we thought about men in the Holocaust that they were just exceptional and extraordinary, we thought that even more about any female perpetrators. That they really had to be very, very odd to be involved in the Holocaust. But I think what we have to recognize as social psychologists is everything we've studied about aggression and obedience to authority, women have tended to score about as high as men in many contexts and many situations. So we shouldn't be surprised if female perpetrators exist. I think what the question we have is, we don't see as many female perpetrators. Is that because females don't have the capacity to perpetrate evil? Or is it because they don't have the same opportunity? Because genocide is going to happen in pretty patriarchal, more conservative society. So on one hand you could argue, well, they just aren't given the opportunity. But then some people may want to say, no, there's something about the feminine nature that makes them less likely to be involved in perpetrating evil. My strong suspicion is that it is they simply haven't been given the opportunity. And when given the opportunity, what we see is, lo and behold, what Holocaust survivors have told us for decades, that women can be as brutal as men, they can commit as many atrocities as men can when given the opportunity, and they can be as nasty and as brutish as men can be given that opportunity. And we certainly see this in Rwanda. The first person convicted of crimes of genocide in Rwanda was a woman, the Minister of Family Affairs. The number of perpetrators in Rwanda is still predominantly male, but we see a pretty high proportion of females there. So I think that's kind of going to be a continuing area of research, but for me it's a question of human nature, and there's nothing about the capacity of evil for humans that, for me, differentiates itself along lines of gender. And I think, again, when women are given the opportunity, we can see a pretty similar level of brutality that we've seen historically in male perpetrators.
Do you think that there are a lot of reasons why genocide is not around, or is it a part of our shadow selves?
Yeah, I think genocide and violence will always be part of human relations. I think it is, you know, it works. I mean, we relate the way we do, and we have things that we have because they work for us. Okay? Your eye structure is the way it is because over the course of time, it has suited our species well. If it stops suiting our species well, it will change over the course of evolutionary history. Aggression and violence, while we may hate it and abhor it, it works for the people who win it and for the people who use it, and we're using it today to work and to win in a way, and to try and, in our perception, make the world better by the use of this. So even when we've learned to cooperate, a lot of times we use cooperation in violence to make violence even, you know, more rigorous than it was before. So I don't, and now you're all thinking, I'm glad I don't live with this guy or have to go out with him afterwards, the most pessimistic guy in the world. I'm not overly pessimistic, but I do want to be realistic and say, I'm not hoping for an end of this. I'm hoping for a world that will intervene more quickly and stop killing more quickly. I'm hoping for a world that recognizes the necessity of international intervention and genocide rather than what for me would be a pretty unrealistic hope that someday, somehow, we just decide we won't perpetrate violence against each other. So, we have time for a couple more? Yes?
About well over a year ago, there was a situation where there was 2 UN nation soldiers in Bulgaria. One was Armenian and one was Azeri, which is Turkish.
Right.
And there's been conflict there, obviously. But they did know each other. The Azeri while they were sleeping in the same tent, killed the Armenians.
Hmm.
And I just never understood that. As if the conflict isn't happening today,
Right.
and obviously he's an ordinary person, but in my mind it's hatred. That's something you haven't mentioned today. I'm wondering, does that come into play?
Yeah, no, I think the issue of hatred to me is part of the, you know, and I criticize Goldhagen not because he talks about ideology, but because he says it's the only thing. I think ideology of hatred especially is one piece of understanding how perpetrators kind of constrict that moral universe, again, to where it's not just right to kill, but it's wrong not to kill. So I do think that that hatred certainly, you know, plays a role in it. I think what, you know, when you have an hour like this tonight, I always have to decide, do I spend more time on kind of my model or more time on setting up the problem and criticizing other people? So, I'd rather criticize others. But there certainly is, you know, as I lay out my understanding of this process of transformation, ideology plays a role there. And sometimes, for me, the key piece of ideology is it defines who's us and who's not us. So that's where religion plays a role, because it defines who is with me and who's not with me. But ideology does hit that point that Robert Sternberg calls, where it transfers from just ideology into hatred, or an ideology of hate. And I do think that plays a role, obviously, in some cases of genocide as well. We have time for one last question? Yes?
In your opinion, do you think that bystanders are perpetrators?
Perpetrators?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Because by not doing anything at all, you're allowing it to happen.
Yeah. Well, the night was going so well, and we have to end with a hard question that I can't answer at all. The question was, if you didn't hear it, was, are bystanders perpetrators of evil at all? This is a great question. You know, it kind of goes back to that theological definitions of what some theologians have called sins of commission, things that you actually commit and do, versus sins of omission, things that you don't do that are still sinful, evil behaviors. In that sense, and I don't know why I'm hesitant, because this is an indictment of me as much as of anyone else, that yeah, I certainly think that bystanders, when they have the knowledge and the opportunity to make a difference and decide not to, that certainly is a crime or evil of omission. Now, it doesn't feel as bad to us because we're not killing people, but it's the things we're omitting doing or choosing not to do that allow killers to keep doing what they're doing. So in that sense, you know, and I look back at Joseph Goebbels, who at one point in the process of the final solution made a comment in a public speech that in his heart he believed that America thought what the Nazis were doing to the Jews was right, that America agreed with him. Now, how in the world could he say that? We were an anti-Semitic country, heavily at that time, but still, how could he say that? Well, he could say it because we weren't doing anything to stop it. And so what scares me about bystanders and omission is how perpetrators take it. And perpetrators take it as legitimization of what they're doing. And this is what, in Bosnia, I mean, they kept pushing kind of the envelope, and we didn't do anything, and it just, they took it as, we have permission to do more and more and more. So in Srebrenica, they can take 8,000 Muslim men and boys, not just out of nowhere, they take them from a UN safe zone, patrolled by the United Nations, because again, no one's just stopped any of this, and not stopping it gives it permission. And that's, I do look at Sudan, and I think, if we remain this relatively silent, I mean, aren't we in some ways just feeding what perpetrators need to do what they need to do in the genocide? So yeah, I would qualify it as certainly an evil in that sense. Well, thank you very much.